From Rhoda, servant girl to Mary, mother of John Mark, Jerusalem. To my dear friend and sister in God's family, Naomi, Antioch. Shalom to you. I'm writing to tell you about all that has been happening with the church in Jerusalem in these days. There's much to report since you left us to spread God's word in Antioch, where we heard the Lord was turning a great number of people's hearts to him. I hear that Barnabas has reached you there and has brought Saul from Antioch. So we are experiencing a famine here, and I hope that the believers there will be moved to help us. Anyway, the danger of following Jesus here has continued, and many of the Jews oppose those who follow Jesus. Even King Herod Agrippa has begun arresting believers, trying to put down those he thinks are causing unrest among the Jews. He's following in the footsteps of his grandfather, Herod the Great, who tried to kill the baby Jesus in Bethlehem, and of his uncle, Herod the Tetrarch, who beheaded John the Baptist. He doesn't understand that Jesus' kingdom is not one of political power that would threaten his reign. One of those he arrested was James, the brother of John and son of Zebedee. We heard that he has now been beheaded. He's the first of the original 12 to be martyred for Jesus. What sorrow has filled the believers to hear this, and now what fear to hear that Peter was also arrested. Why, O God, why do you allow evil men who do not follow you to add to the suffering of your people? We're already hungry with the famine. We're already put down by the Pharisees and Sadducees who reject Jesus, rejected in the synagogue at times, ignored in the market. Why must we also see a faithful servant of yours imprisoned unjustly and die? As you know, Naomi, we've just finished the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. Having Peter in prison during these days brought back so many memories for those earliest disciples who followed Jesus 10 years ago. How they suffered as they thought of those hours they passed waiting to hear news after Jesus' arrest, of the anguish of his crucifixion, of the heartache of that Sabbath when they thought all was lost. Will Peter also be lost? Will he follow our Lord's footsteps into suffering and death? Jesus did make that prediction about him being led where he didn't want to go. Will the church lose such an important leader, especially just as he's been moving towards sharing the good news more with Gentiles, like Cornelius in Caesarea? I thought of the many times Peter had spoken kindly to me when we met in our house church. Many of us had been meeting in different houses where we have our church meetings to pray fervently together. And our meeting at Mary's house that night was no different. In fact, since most of us know Peter well, since he usually attends our house church, we were probably even more heartfelt. We know we are helpless against the king's power, but we believe in prayer to a God who is not helpless. Believers who were leaders in the Jewish community and those who were humble servants like me poured out our hearts to God, pleading for Peter's life and his rescue. We'd been praying most of that night at the end of the festival, since we knew that Peter's life was at risk as the festival drew to a close and King Herod Agrippa could now bring him to trial and death. Deborah had just begun to sing a psalm when suddenly I heard a knocking on the door. Since it's my job to open the outer door beyond the courtyard, I went to answer it. Much to my surprise, I recognized the voice calling from outside. It was Peter. I was so overcome with joy that I ran back to let the believers know, without even opening the door for him. I just thought they couldn't wait in fear and pleading a moment longer when God had answered our prayers. "Peter is at the door," I exclaimed. The others didn't believe me at first. Nathanael said I was crazy, And Joseph said, "It's his guardian angel who just took on his appearance." But as Peter kept knocking, the other believers finally agreed to open the door and realized it was indeed him. I laughed with the other believers over how I'd left him standing outside the door after we all prayed for just such a miracle. We were amazed to hear Peter's account of how the Lord had rescued him from the prison. An angel woke him, striking him, kicking him in the ribs, and his chains simply fell off his wrists. The angel led him through the prison, passing different sets of guards, and finally, the iron gate opened by itself, and they passed into the city. You know that iron gate from the Antonia fortress? Only the hand of God could have opened that from the inside. Oh, what a God we serve. He is the God of the Israelites, who walked through the Red Sea on their way out of slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land, as we just celebrated with Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. He is the God of the resurrection, who rolled away the stone of Jesus' tomb, just as Peter was returned to us with that open gate, nearly from the dead. Oh God, would you do more of these works? Set free the enslaved, that they might praise you with their freedom. Bring life to those nearly dead, that they may honor you with their breath. Rescue those in darkness and captivity, for you are a God whose saving acts lead to liberty and light. Provide for those who are hungry, like we are in this famine, whose stomachs grumble and whose children cry. For you are the God who provided for Israel through Joseph. But the story doesn't end yet, not even there. King Herod Agrippa recently moved from Jerusalem to Caesarea. I've heard that he was giving a speech to the people, wearing a shiny silver robe that reflected the morning sun, and the awestruck listeners thought and said he was a god. He didn't correct them, enjoying the adoration and attention for himself. And the angel of the Lord struck him down because he didn't give praise to God. He died in suffering, eaten by worms, humiliated, and brought low. He'd only ruled for 3 years before his actions brought about these consequences. He thought to rule like a god, but the true God made it clear that he's the one in charge. It reminds me of the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. For 3 years in those days, they also knew hunger because there was no rain. It was because Ahab and Jezebel worshipped the idols, especially Baal and Asherah. Elijah asked Ahab to assemble all Israel and all the false prophets at Mount Carmel. And there he told the people they had to choose if Yahweh was God or if Baal was. He set up a demonstration to show who was the true God. But despite the hours of frantically calling on Baal, bleeding for him, the prophets of Baal didn't get Baal to send fire on his altar. Elijah then asked the people to come to his altar of 12 stones and drenched it in water 3 times. Then, with a simple prayer, Elijah prayed and asked the Lord to answer him, to turn the hearts back to him again, and fire fell. When the people finally recognized, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. This is still true today. Even a king like Herod Agrippa, raised in Rome with future emperors, with powerful friends who gave him power over so much of Israel's land, is not powerful like our God. Instead, the true power lies with Yahweh, who opened the Red Sea, the tomb, and Peter's prison cell. He answers our prayers beyond what we even imagined he would answer. And yet, he remains God. He's not manipulated by our requests, and he has not always answered what we hoped. He brings consequences to those who oppose him, as Herod Agrippa did. He will bring justice to his world. He will bring his kingdom and his reign, and one day everyone will see it, whether they want to or not. And yet, my emotions vacillate. I want to celebrate God's saving acts in Peter's rescue, whose story I heard recounted with my own ears. But I also mourn the loss of James, so strong and faithful a witness to Jesus. I worry for those believers still in prison. Even Elijah followed God's triumph at Mount Carmel with fleeing, disheartened when Jezebel remained unconvinced. John the Baptist's testimony to Jesus led to his imprisonment and death. Jesus' own perfect life led to his arrest, beating, and humiliating, excruciatingly painful death on the cross. Maybe in Jesus' story lies my answer, because what looked like defeat was not the end of the story. What looks like heartbreaking defeat for Jesus' reign spreading in our world, people dying of hunger, children suffering, the vulnerable taken advantage of, wars that feel out of our reach to impact, people who once followed, who turn their backs on Jesus' way. These do not mean the story ends there, even if we do see some people's earthly lives end in suffering. But God used Jesus' suffering and death to accomplish the biggest victory the world has ever seen in the empty tomb. I don't have to understand it all. I just have to trust that he walks with us in darkness, bringing light and freedom. Sometimes it is literal, like Peter's rescue was. But James is just as free now, more free even, in the light of Jesus' presence. As the psalmist says, "Give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name, make known among the nations what he has done. Sing to him, sing praise to him, tell of all his wonderful acts. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord and his strength. Seek his face always." Pass my greetings to the other believers. I hope you can visit us soon in Jerusalem. Maybe if Saul and Barnabas come to visit the leaders again. So, it's been a couple years since I've worn this. I've tried today to portray Rhoda's perspective, to help us hear this story again, to connect with it on an emotional level with our lives. I give you some questions to reflect on as we close. Do you or someone you love need God's rescue? May we find our faith renewed and strengthened by Rhoda's story of God's answer to prayer and his miraculous rescue of Peter from prison. We serve a God who still opens iron gates and still sets people free. Do you need light in the darkness and a reminder of God's presence? God could have magically translocated Peter to Mary's house, like he swept away Philip from the Ethiopian eunuch. But he sends the angel of light into the darkness instead to lead Peter out. May we have our eyes opened anew to find ways that God is shining light in darkness and accompanying us in dark times. Are you struggling with unanswered prayer? Are you struggling with why God has allowed someone to suffer or die? Beloved, I do not have the answers for why, but I know the one who does, and I trust his love even when I don't understand it. Following Jesus can be costly and even dangerous, as it was for the early disciples. Is God calling you to be willing to pay the price for following him? Peter and James, as well as nearly all the apostles eventually, knew that following Jesus was worth more than anything they could give up. Do you need to pray about a crisis in your life or our world? As one of the commentators wrote, if extended, fervent, united prayer is not a church's first resort in a time of crisis, the church reveals that it is ultimately depending on something or someone other than God. Have you started to doubt that God is really in control? Do you feel tempted to depend on power, political or otherwise, to achieve God's aims? Do you want to take recognition for yourself that belongs to God? May the consequences of Herod Agrippa be a sober reminder to us of who is really God, who accomplishes his purposes in his time and in his way. May the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel encourage us that God is who he says he is. Do you feel disheartened by injustice and the apparent defeats that face God's kingdom's advance? May the empty tomb remind you that God can use even suffering and injustice to bring about his purposes.